The planter aristocracy owned the best land, forcing the yeoman farmers to scratch out a living in the less fertile backcountry and mountain valleys that remained. Since they didn't own land, they could not hold political office.
Western land wasn't free, and the poor rarely had the funds to buy the parcels sold by the federal government. Instead, they invaded public lands as trespassers, and the government often had to physically remove them. They became the dominant class of the early republic and the antebellum period that you've never heard of. America's version of English vagrants, squatters, and crackers.
Which meant they had less representation in both national and state governments. In addition, people who owned slaves were often allowed to include their slaves when calculating population, giving them a huge advantage in their state legislatures.
Now, the legendary Davy Crockett, believe it or not, was an outspoken advocate of squatters' rights. That's the real Crockett, not the legend.
Places like South Carolina, the large plantation counties, where the black population actually outnumbers the white population 4-to-1 in some cases, meaning that the authority of the wealthy is magnified at almost every step in the local, state, and federal government, giving them extraordinary power in this region, and also silencing non-slaveholding poor white people, very often in both state politics and in national politics.
That one of the many excellent powers that he had the ability to squat down lower than any man. But this allusion is particularly important because he's referring to his own squatter past. In the British law, which we inherited, squatting was the opposite of standing, to have legal standing. And legal standing also was part of the legal principle, the English legal principle, that justified claims to sovereignty and also justifies the right to the land, to have standing.
But most poor yeoman farmers didn't blame the slave system for this vast inequality. In fact, most poor whites defended the institution of slavery, knowing in their hearts that at least they were superior to slaves in one way. The whites had their freedom.
Europeans just had their freedom, but what did they do with their freedom while black was enslaved? They was not allowed to own property. They was not allowed to vote. Be clear about these things. They had no rights as people. They had no wealth as people the entire time blacks was enslaved.
Northern businessmen looked to the devastated South and saw opportunity. Land was cheap, and factories quickly turned Southern resources, like cotton, into profit. But the profits went north, leaving the South in a state of poverty.
Poor whites were in a dire position, just like former slaves, and they had to try to get back on their feet. Many of them still owned their land, but land is not the only thing you need. You need tools, you need seed, fertilizer, etc. And so what they did was borrow money in order to get farming again.
Local merchants and planters lent money to these poor white farmers in exchange for a percentage of their incoming crops.
And unfortunately, in the chaotic conditions of the South, the crops failed. It was very hard to market them. And so many poor whites fall further and further into debt after the war because of this situation in the South.
This area was originally a federal encampment where emancipated slaves came. They flocked here.
The Union Army occupied Little Rock on September 10th, 1863. And when that happened, thousands of blacks started to pour into Little Rock.
In fact, a lot of Southern plantation owners were so mad, they loaded up their slaves and they just drove them to Little Rock in their wagons and dumped them off. And they might have a little bundle of maybe some food and maybe a few belongings, but that's it.
They're liberating themselves. They're liberating themselves with their feet. They know Union troops are nearby. They know slavery never worked for them. So they're going to these places where they can begin to make sense out of life and to begin to live life as freed people.
A lot of things that are necessary to grow an economy and grow a community were not really available to Black people at that time, just post-Reconstruction. And the way that it was provided by was the formation of fraternal organizations.
Republicans in North Carolina were successful in part because of a third party called the Populist Party, made up of mostly white farmers fed up with the tough economic times. North Carolina populists joined up with Republicans to form what they called the Fusion Party. And in the elections of 1894 and 1896, the Fusion Party defeated the Democrats in sweeping victories statewide. That meant North Carolina now had a government that shared power between black and white politicians, including a newly elected Republican governor. Together, they moved towards reforms that would favor black Americans and working class whites.
They existed because black people couldn't expect to be admitted into predominantly white fraternal organizations. And so what's happening on 9th Street is happening in black communities all over the country. They're forming mutual aid kinds of societies to help each other out in difficult times.
The official name of the Taborians was the Order of the 12, the Knights and Daughters of Tabor. They were founded in 1872 by the Reverend Moses Dixon. He was a minister of African Methodist Episcopal Church. He died in 1901.
This was the grand temple and tabernacle of the Knights and Daughters of Tabor. It was black built and paid for with contributions from Arkansans, from chapters all over Arkansas. And it wasn't cheap. It was $65,000 when that was a lot of money.
When we learn about the Reconstruction era in school, it's often taught as a dark period in American history, a time of upheaval and unrest right after the Civil War. But what often gets overlooked is that for a brief period of time, thousands of black representatives were elected to office all over the South.
My estimate is that there were about 2,000 African American men who held public office during Reconstruction. Offices ranging from the Senate, there were 2 black senators, 14 members of the House of Representatives, 600 or 700 members of state legislatures, and then dozens of other offices, state level, local level, etc.
So what was going on was that, first of all, a lot of the former Confederates, the most outspoken leaders of white supremacy, were not allowed to serve in Congress. And so, with those people absent, there were people that
Wilmington, prior to November 1898, was what the New South could be at the cusp of the 20th century.
There was an unusual degree of black prosperity.
In Wilmington, there were successful black entrepreneurs, doctors, teachers, but also black elected officials. And for a time, that was true throughout the state. Take a look at the politicians on this poster of the 1889 North Carolina House of Representatives. Here at the bottom are black Republican representatives, some from Wilmington. North Carolina also sent 4 black Republicans to the U.S. Congress between 1875 and 1899. The Democrats
little shanty town, and it consisted of tents and shacks, and this is where they put the former slaves.
Blissville basically became the core for the early black commercial district. It was established really just west of where Mount Holly Cemetery is, right in close proximity to 9th Street. Something new was happening in Arkansas in terms of just societal change.
The Republicans gained control, passed a new constitution, which meant that African Americans now, for the first time, African American males, of course, would be able to vote. Comes as a surprise to a lot of people, but there were 20 African Americans in the Arkansas legislature. 16 of them were in the House, and there were 4 senators. Of course, we've never had that many African Americans in the Arkansas legislature since then.
During this time, Wilmington's Black businesses grew at a faster pace than any other North Carolina city. In 1897, over 1,000 African Americans owned some sort of property in Wilmington. The city's African American population was enriched by schools, wealth, and inherited status.
We had a new kind of type of African American living here, a Black urban middle class.
You know, you're talking about people who understand very well that they have to be self-sufficient, that they have to be self-contained. We're also talking about people who are very intelligent. They understand well the times in which they live and the things that they need to do in order to survive. And also, when we're talking about people who may have been formerly enslaved, that doesn't mean everybody was in the field picking cotton. Some of these people had skills.
The 1870s and 1880s businesses were being established, especially from Broadway, which was kind of anchored the east end of the West 9th Street business district, all the way down to Ringo Street. And in that kind of 6-block area, majority were operated by African Americans.
When the last of the Union troops marched out of the South in 1877, most white Southerners heaved a sigh of relief. They believed that the economic situation would improve once the Army left. They were sorely mistaken.
Well, of course, poor whites were devastated by the war like anyone else. Much of their land had been marched over and destroyed, tools, crops, animals, bridges. You know, many were thrown into poverty by the war. There was a high death rate, of course.
I don't like the culture vultures DJ Khaled, but in my DJ Khaled voice, and another city.
The city of Rosewood was known for being a clean, quiet, self-sufficient Black neighborhood. The economy was mainly drawn from the timber industry, as cedar wood was used to make pencils, which helped the economy thrive. By the year 1920, the residents of Rosewood were mostly self-sufficient. They had 3 churches, a school, a large Masonic hall, a turpentine mill, a sugarcane mill, a baseball team named the Rosewood Stars, and 2 general stores. The village had about a dozen 2-story wooden plank homes, other small 2-room houses, and several small unoccupied plank farm and storage structures. Some families owned pianos, organs, and other symbols of middle-class prosperity. Rosewood is remembered by the survivors as an independent, thriving, happy.
And another one.
3 lots for $125. Epiphany Davis, a store clerk, bought 12 lots for $578. And the AME Zion Church purchased another 6 lots. From there, a community was born. From its modest beginnings, the village had grown over 3 decades to include as many as 300 residents, numerous homes and gardens, 3 churches, 2 schools, and 3 cemeteries. 70% of the residents were African American, and 30% were Irish American. Over half of residents own their own homes.
Community called Slocum in Texas. Slocum, Texas was part of the East Texas oil field, which remains one of the largest ever in the continental United States, encompassing 5 counties. Unlike most Texas communities in the early 20th century, the unincorporated town of Slocum, like Rosewood, Florida, was largely African American, with several Black citizens having owned considerable amount of property.
Oklahoma had 45 Black towns and municipalities. It was capital of Black self-determination. I liken it to a city within a city. Greenwood itself is an area of nearly 40 square blocks, with individual neighborhoods, individual churches that have their own parishes.
About 40 to 45 blocks of a residential community with a business district.
Many African American communities in the United States were thriving in the 1910s and 20s. But the high level of home ownership in Greenwood made Tulsa's Black district distinctive.
Now, for some white people, a Black person with any wealth, then as well as today, is something that created jealousy.
Because of this situation in the South in the post-war period.
Burdened by debt and overcome by their resentment of landowners' power, poor whites became angrier and angrier. Their frustration fueled intense racism as they sought to elevate their own lowly status by degrading their black peers.
Whites was never in the same predicament as us. Black was always far worse off. The difference is that whites fail to understand that their oppressors has always been the elite Anglo-Saxon whites. Blacks coming out of slavery turned inwards towards themselves because they knew that they could not count on these any Europeans for justice. So they formed organizations, they shared skills, resources in order to help build various Blacks communities. This is why Blacks need a self-imposed segregation now. Because integration has not worked. It has harmed the mind state of us as a people. It has harmed the mind state of our youth. It has disrupted our family values, completely destroyed the concept of Black family. We need a self-imposed segregation because Blacks do well self-impose. All European nations crumble because of inequality. From Greek to the Romans, every European economy has always suffered from mass inequality.
The State Democratic Party handbook for 1898 laid out their goal: consolidate the white vote by stoking white anger and resentment. It said, "This is a white man's country, and white men must control and govern it."
Have the Irish story utterly and completely disappeared as if it never existed. None of the Irish victims ever made it back to their homeland to describe their ordeal. These are the lost slaves, the ones that time and biased history books conveniently forgot. If you want to know more about this subject, I honestly say that you should really check it out, as I found everything that I read today from Google. It was very easy to search. I just typed in white slavery and started reading. And there's so much on this subject, but yet so little is taught in schools about it. It makes me wonder if
at the end of the Civil War, Blacks teamed up with poor whites in order to gain political power, in order to work in our interests. But because we had certain skills and work ethic that allowed us to prosper as a people, this created envy with those who had allied with us, which was poor whites. Our success created anger and envy from them. So in return, they went and promoted the very people who had already enslaved them once, bringing them to America. They brought them to America as indentured servants in exchange to pay for their voyage here because life was so hard in Europe. This was a debt that placed them into servitude. Understand that when Blacks was released from freedom, they acquired another debt which took them back into servitude. While we was in slavery, they was not loaning these poor whites money. They were not building schools for these poor whites to educate their children. So under white rule, they had benefited nothing. So their thinking is so irrational that you cannot live amongst these people because they are uncivilized. As a collective, there are individuals that are, yes, but as a collective, they are uncivilized. You was enslaved and impoverished by the top percent. If you look at the wealth equality gap right now, you will see that majority of the wealth is in the top 1%. So when they talk about going back to a white rule, they're talking about a system that was oppressive to them. And there's no negotiating with people who lack any common sense or logic. And you see this today with the Trump supporters. Subscribe and like the page.